most probiotic-containing foods have no living bacteria. Most yogurts, they're all dead. Kimchi, they're all dead. That's a bunch of hooey. Well, it turns out that these dead bacteria have made postbiotics, and the wall of that bacteria contains important information that is read by bacteria in the gut with the gut microbiome. There may be what we think is a really nasty bacteria. If that bacteria gets into our bloodstream, it does really bad things. And maybe we should eradicate that bad bacteria. No, that bad bacteria is there for a reason. If you have leaky gut, I will guarantee you have leaky brain. If you don't want depression, if you don't want dementia or Parkinson's, then you don't want leaky gut because you don't want leaky brain.
Dr. Gundry, in the new book, you make it very clear that we're basically doing everything we could in a negative way to destroy the gut microbiome. So take us through the biggest culprits and what we're doing there.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think Hippocrates was right 2,500 years ago when he said all disease begins in the gut. I don't think he knew about the gut microbiome, but perhaps he did. I try to make a case in my last several books that the gut microbiome, all 100 trillion different organisms that live in our gut and in our mouth and on our skin, pretty much control everything that's going to happen to us, good or bad. Sorry about that. And each year, thanks to the Human Microbiome Project, we've learned that these guys are far more important than anybody except Hippocrates knew. We've done a great job of making sure that they don't do their job, and that would be pretty dumb. I guess let's start from the top. Modern broad spectrum antibiotics were introduced about 50 years ago, actually, when I was in medical school. And we thought they were miraculous because we could take somebody who had an infection and we didn't know what the infection was caused by. And rather than waiting several days to grow out a bug in a petri dish and then figure out which antibiotic would work, we could actually carpet bomb whatever bug we thought might be causing the infection with antibiotics that basically killed off everything. And it was miraculous from doctor's standpoint. But little did we know that in carpet bombing whatever bacteria we suspected was causing an infection, we also killed off the microbiome that lived in us, which is probably not a good idea. Now, it turns out that antibiotics, particularly broad-spectrum antibiotics, were discovered to be a really good way to make animals grow faster and grow fatter. And so over 70% of all the antibiotics used in the United States are actually given to farm animals in feedlots. And recently, in fact, last week, a new publication showed that almost all of our fast food is loaded with antibiotics that are actually illegal. And there they are in every single one of our fast foods that we eat on a daily basis. So that's bad news because the animals eat these antibiotics, and those antibiotics are incorporated into their flesh so that we actually eat those antibiotics when we eat a burger or chicken or whatever, pork. And those antibiotics kill off our microbiome unwittingly to us. The second thing that happened about 50 years ago is Monsanto invented glyphosate, Roundup. And glyphosate, the weed killer, ushered in genetically modified organisms. But that's actually not the horrible thing that happened with Roundup. Roundup is used in almost all conventional farming to dry plants, to kill plants like corn, like oats, like soybeans, before they're harvested. Because having grown up in Omaha, Nebraska, I can tell you it's a lot easier and more efficient to harvest a field when it's dead than it is when it's alive and full of water. Water carries a lot of weight. And so farmers now traditionally, in conventional farming, spray Roundup on their crops before they harvest to kill them. Nobody washes the Roundup off the corn or the wheat or the rye or the oats. So these foods are fed to our animals, and the Roundup goes into their meat. And we eat these foods that are sprayed with Roundup. Almost all of our wheat is glyphosate positive. All of our oats are glyphosate positive, including many organic oat products are glyphosate positive. It's sprayed in our wine in California on the vineyards. So we are awash in glyphosate. So what? Well, it turns out that glyphosate was patented not as a weed killer, it was patented as an antibiotic. And it's really good at killing off the particular bacteria that work on what's called the tryptophan pathway in the gut. Tryptophan becomes 5-HTP, becomes serotonin, the feel-good molecule. And isn't it interesting that we have an epidemic of anxiety and depression corresponding with when Roundup was introduced as a weed killer? Because we've killed off that pathway of bugs. So that's just a top of the iceberg. But those are two of the huge things that really we've done to destroy our microbiome.
All right, so to go over that again, antibiotics that we directly take, broad spectrum. Animals are now being given antibiotics, and then we take those in through the meats.
Correct.
Then we got glyphosate, which is going to end up in the meat because the animals are eating the produce or grains, actually, that are grown.
Grains, correct.
With that sprayed on them. What do we do to avoid all that? Obviously, when it comes to taking antibiotics, there's cases where that is necessary if we have certain infections and such, and we'll go over the best way to handle that down the line. But when it comes to the food piece, how do we mitigate the effects of the antibiotics and the glyphosate? Obviously, organic seems like our best bet, but I believe in there you said even organic is still affected. What do we do?
Yeah, I'll give you an example from here in Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara is a big wine growing region, and I know a number of the winemakers. One of the winemakers is Beckman Vineyards, and they are biodynamic, which is one step above organic, and we won't go into that. But anyhow, he's got a map of all his vineyards and which ones are used for which wine, and there's this little block up at the top that is part of his vineyards, but they don't use in their wine. And I said, well, what's the deal with that? He says, my neighbors spray glyphosate between the rows, and it drifts. And so we can't use those grapes. We'll sell them to other people who don't care, but we'll refuse to use them. And he says, and we can't stop our neighbors. That's their practices. So the point is, even if you grow organically, grow oats organically or grow wheat organically, your neighbor on the field over may be aerial spraying glyphosate, and it'll drift. And that's why many of the organic oat products that have been tested show glyphosate in them, despite the fact that they were raised organic.
If you're enjoying this episode, let me know by tapping like and subscribe below. Thank you so much, and now back to the chat. All right, well, which leads us to what do we do? Because then if we're somebody that's eating oats directly, or some of these grains that are being sprayed or being fed to the animals and we're eating those, we know organic isn't necessarily even safe. Somebody like you, knowing what you know, how do we navigate the food world to avoid, at least to the best we can, glyphosate antibiotics?
Well, one thing you can do is move to Europe. Europe is increasingly banning glyphosate. It's each year, many more countries ban the use of glyphosate. That may change because, as most people know, Bayer, which is a European company, bought Monsanto a few years ago. And Bayer makes multiple contributions to the European Union legislatures. So we'll see. But right now, it's actually much safer to go to Europe. I'll give you great examples, and I write about it in my books. I'm able to, about 80% of my patient population is autoimmune patients who haven't had any success or hate the drugs they're on, the biologics, don't think they ought to be on biologics for the rest of their life and want to get off of them. And I've published a couple of papers now that we have a better than 90% remission rate in 9 months to a year following the program and gut check. So these folks with psoriasis or rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, they resolve their issue. Their biomarkers are negative for these diseases. Their symptoms are gone. And they go over to Europe, just as an example, and they go on vacation. And who can resist having a croissant in France or a pizza in Italy or spaghetti and pasta in Italy? And they don't have a reaction. And they're doing great. And they go, wow, Dr. Gundry has cured me. So they come back pretty pleased with themselves, and they start eating our breads or our pizzas. And within a couple of weeks, they're flaring. So they're on the phone or on the email going, what the heck? I thought you cured me. What's going on? And they started eating our food again. So we've just set ourselves up to destroy our microbiome and to cause leaky gut, which is the other piece of this puzzle. So that's one way of doing it. The other way to do it is get to know your farmers, find out what they're using in their fields, find out what they're feeding their animals. One of the things that shocks, not me, but my patients, is they'll get pastured chicken, for example, and they'll maybe not resolve their issue. And I go, well, where are you getting the pastured chicken? Oh, there's a farmer. I said, well, why don't you ask him what he feeds his chicken? And they say, oh, we have. It's all organic feed. And most of the time they're out, pecking, but it's organic feed. I said, well, what kind of organic feed? Oh, organic corn, organic soybeans, organic wheat. And I go, well, that's not going to work. You are what you eat, but you are what the thing you're eating ate. And so I have no relationship with this wonderful farmer in Texas, Farmer Dan, who actually decided after reading my books that he was going to feed his pastured chicken lectin-free food. And he has a website called lectinlightchicken.com. I've had him on my podcast, Farmer Dan. And so he's now giving his food to other farmers so that they can raise their chickens properly. And it's going to have to take that sort of commitment to get back to what we were doing. The other thing I do is if I'm looking for eggs or chicken in my farmer's market, I'll go, what do you feed your chickens? And the correct answer is I don't feed them anything. They work for me. And that brings me back to my childhood in Nebraska. Chickens were not fed anything. Chickens were farm animals that were put out in the fields, and they'd go dig through the cow pies, the cow manure, looking for bugs. And they would spread the manure looking for the bugs. And then they'd come back to the hen house and lay their eggs. And you wouldn't eat a chicken because they were too valuable until the old hen couldn't lay anymore, and then she became a stewing hen. And I talk about that in the book. Way back when, you cooked that hen for several days and all of the collagen broke down, and you got plenty of collagen through just doing something like that. But nobody does that anymore. So we just got to get back to the way things used to happen.
All right. A lot of interesting ways people can go about navigating this, but I want to make sure we're really practical for the average person who isn't necessarily going to be able to connect with Farmer Dan or go overseas and relocate. What you're saying here is we need to be on the lookout of glyphosate getting in the food And then also we have to be sure that the animals are being fed the right diet. So there's two different pieces I want to make sure we grasped here. For people that are out there buying just like organic chicken and thinking they're doing a good thing,
what a disaster.
They could eliminate a lot of the glyphosate, but it could still trickle in. But then there's the antibiotic piece. So if we buy organic, let's start to pick this apart and get really practical to give people the guidance to start to do some of this stuff to make better choices. If they buy organic, we can assume a lot of the glyphosate isn't in there, at least not directly. 2, can we assume that antibiotics aren't being used to being given to these animals? No. Okay. Talk about that. What can we do to eliminate that?
Part of the problem is the organic chicken law was passed in 2007, introduced by a Georgia congressman from a chicken growing district. And basically the definition of a organic free-range chicken, you can keep 100,000 chicken in a warehouse, which is routine, and never let them out, but open the door in that warehouse to a 3-yard by 3-yard patch of grass for 5 minutes every day. And the chicken has the potential to go outside. Now, of course, if you're on the other end of the warehouse where the door is open, you'll never get past the 100,000 chickens to get out. And anyone who's raised chickens know that chickens really don't like to poke their head outside because a hawk might be waiting for them. So, but that's the definition of organic free range. Now, it gets better than that. If a veterinarian believes that one of the chickens is ill, then the veterinarian has the right to feed all 100,000 of those chickens antibiotics to treat the one chicken that that veterinarian thinks is ill. And why would a veterinarian do that? Because the veterinarian is hired by these major corporations, and things happen. That's why in this recent survey of organic chickens that were bought, 60% of them had traces of antibiotics. And it's like, wow. Now it gets worse than that. And I write about that towards the end of Gut Check. And this is something that Farmer Dan shared with me, but I think it's really important information. Normally, if a chicken or a cow is out foraging in grass and eating bugs, the ratio of omega-6 fats, short-chain omega-6 fats, which are, quote, the inflammatory fat, the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, short-chain omega-3s, which are, quote, the anti-inflammatory fat, is about 3 to 1. 3 parts omega-6, 1 part omega-3. Rarely any better than that in natural habitats. So that seems to be the natural ratio. An organic chicken is fed organic corn and soybeans. And an organic chicken bought in a supermarket has 25 parts omega-6 to 1 part omega-3. 25 to 1. So a chicken is no longer a chicken. It's an ear of corn or a soybean with feathers. And so we may be eating organically, but we're eating an incredibly inflammatory piece of meat that in the good old days, 50 years ago, wouldn't have existed. And so just the term organic is being marketed as something that might be profoundly healthy, but in fact might be exactly the opposite of what you think you're getting.
And the sad truth with what you're saying there, that if it is the opposite, you're making this extra effort to find organic, spending the extra money, and you have this increased sense of security for you and your family that you're providing nourishing, healthy food, when it sounds like you're basically step one of many in the right direction, but you're far from there.
Yeah, and that's the sad part of so much of this, that our food, it looks like a chicken. Doesn't taste like a chicken anymore, but it certainly looks like a chicken. But it's not chicken anymore. And I wrote about this in my first book. Part of my training, we moved to London, England to learn children's heart surgery. And I had 2 young children. And they really missed Kentucky Fried Chicken. And this was in the mid-'80s. And the first Kentucky Fried Chicken opened in England, in London. And my kids said, "Oh my gosh, we got to go get Kentucky Fried Chicken. This is great. Please, Daddy." So we get in the tube and we go over there. Now, back in those days, there was such a surplus of fish in England that chickens were fed ground up fish meal. And the chicken flesh was translucent, like a fish. And so we go to Kentucky Fried Chicken. Kids grab a drumstick and they bite it and they go, "Oh, this isn't chicken, this is fish." And I go, no, it's a chicken. Look, that's the leg, that's not fish. "No, you tricked us, it's fish, ew." It was a fish because that's what they had been fed. And it should have sunk in way back then that you are what you eat, but you are what the thing you're eating. So all we're doing with organic chicken now is eating organic corn and soybeans, which is just an inflammatory nightmare. To say nothing of the fact that corn and soybeans are loaded with lectins, and those become part of the flesh as well.
Wow. So we're painting a pretty dismal picture early on here, but to recap what we're getting at here, the things so far I can see we need to be aware of: what the animal's eating, the actual specific diet. Is that animal getting antibiotics? And it sounds like, well, not sounds like, you confirm the fact that even organic, it's very easy for them to get treated with antibiotics.
Yep.
And then the other piece is the glyphosate. Even if it's organic, if that trickles over on the feed and those animals are eating it, it's going to be part of their composition that we're going to eat. And this is all for organic, let alone conventional.
Correct.
So it seems like, and the part about this that becomes really frustrating is the fact we're only talking about chicken here. So this is like, okay, I figured my chicken thing out. I found a chicken farmer nearby and I'm getting my chicken. Okay, that might be great for chicken and eggs, but I still have to figure out all the other calories and different things I'm going to take in and all the corrupt things that could be happening with them as well.
Yeah, and it even gets worse than that. I know there's a movement for grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and that certainly is better than feedlot beef. But I talked about in the Plant Paradox about a interesting sugar molecule that is called Neu5Gc, capital G, and it's present in beef, lamb, pork, and also milk. And we have a different sugar molecule in us that's called Neu5Ac, capital A. Now, those two molecules differ by only one molecule of oxygen. They're otherwise identical. And in the Plant Paradox, I talked about the fact that we know that when we eat Neu5Gc containing foods, beef, lamb, pork, or milk, that we make antibodies to Neu5Gc, this sugar molecule, because it is foreign. And that's interesting in itself. We've known for a very long time that there's a strong association between red meat eating and milk and heart disease, arthritis, dementia, and cancer. Very strong associations. Now, association does not mean causation. I'm the first to agree with that. So for a number of years, we were trying to figure out, okay, why is there such a strong association? And one of the theories is that because Neu5Ac and Neu5Gc look so similar, and we make antibodies to Neu5Gc, we maybe by mistake attack our sugar molecule, Neu5Ac. It's called molecular mimicry. Now, why is that important? Well, Neu5Ac, as I talk about in Gut Check, lines the protective layer on our blood vessels. It lines the protective layer in our blood-brain barrier, a virtual impenetrable barrier. It lines our joints. And it's called the glycocalyx for anyone who cares, and there won't be a test, I promise. So now we know that the more Neu5Gc containing foods we eat, the more it's incorporated into the lining, the glycocalyx of our blood vessels, the glycocalyx of our brain, the glycocalyx of our joints. And it's kind of swapped off. So, and you can show in experimental animals that the more Neu5Gc you eat, the more it ends up in these places and displaces Neu5Ac. Now, Neu5Ac is in chicken and fish and shellfish in us. And you can show that the more Neu5Ac containing foods you eat, and the less Neu5Gc containing foods you eat, the more Neu5Gc is displaced from these very important structures with Neu5Ac. So now there's no longer a question, at least in my mind and many others, that this is a causation that actually is a reason why. So we literally attack our lining of our blood vessels, our brain lining, our joint lining, because of this abnormal sugar molecule that we make antibodies to. Even worse, animals who have Neu5Gc won't let Neu5Gc in their brain because it's an incredibly neuroinflammatory compound. And it won't exist inside their brains. And yet, if we eat Neu5Gc, it breaks down the blood-brain barrier and gets into our brains, where it's one of the best causes of neuroinflammation anyone's ever discovered, which explains the high association with red meat eating and dementia. Man.
All right, I got to break this down. There's a lot here. So Neu5Gc is in things like red meat, milk from dairy cows.
From goats, from sheep.
Goats and sheep too?
Yep.
Okay. So when we eat these foods, that becomes incorporated in our tissues, and we make antibodies against it at the same time?
Correct.
Okay, so those antibodies are obviously going to attack that tissue of our body that's been incorporated with the Neu5Gc.
Yep.
And it can also cross the blood-brain barrier and cause problems up in the brain and the head as well. Okay, so given all this, we're taking all these foods right off the table according to your new book and your new diet. Red meat.
No.
Okay, wait, there is a caveat there. What I read in the book, we can ferment to get rid of them. Okay, let's get into that. So for somebody right now where their head is spinning saying, these foods we're talking about are a big part of my diet, let's talk about fermenting and if there's any other ways we can, quote unquote, treat these foods to make them palatable.
Yeah, what's fascinating is last year there was a paper out of Norway that looked at people with what's called stable angina. Stable angina means you have blockages in your coronary arteries that are there. And when you walk fast or exercise fast, you get chest pain, you get angina. And if you stop, your angina goes away and it's stable. It doesn't really change. So they looked at a large number of human beings with stable angina, and they followed their consumption of butter, milk, and cheese. And they showed that the more butter a person ate, then the more their stable angina would become unstable angina, basically become a heart attack. Same with milk. The more milk a person drank, the same thing happened. Now, with cheese, on the other hand, the more cheese a person ate, the better their stable angina got. In other words, it improved. Now, the headline that made all the news was dairy is really bad for the heart. Well, butter and milk was bad for the heart, but cheese was exactly the opposite. And that unfortunately didn't make the news because that's not really cool. So what happened with the cheese? Well, the cheese, it turns out that bacteria love sugar. That's what they like to eat. And bacteria ferment sugar. When we yeast ferments sugar. When we make wine, the yeast are fermenting the sugar in the grapes, and so on and so forth. In cheese, the bacteria in a traditional cheese culture eat the Neu5Gc that was present in the milk. And there isn't any Neu5Gc. For instance, there's no Neu5Gc in Parmesan cheese, just as an example. There's no Neu5Gc in pecorino, sheep cheese. But there's oodles of it in the cow's milk that went into Parmesan cheese, and there's oodles of it in the sheep milk that went into the pecorino. But the bacteria ate it. And as I talk about in the book, these bacteria make all these really cool compounds that really promote longevity called polyamines. And one of my favorite ones is spermidine, and you can guess where that name came from. So fast forward, the longest living people in the world by country is the longest lifespan of any country is a little tiny country between France and Spain called Andorra. And Andorra is way up in the Pyrenees Mountains, about 150,000 people. They're primarily sheep and goat herders, and their diet consists of a lot of goat and sheep cheese, but they eat tons of sausages every day. In fact, Toulouse, which is very nearby in the French border, Toulouse is famous for their sausages and foie gras, and Toulouse, despite that diet, has the lowest incidence of coronary artery disease in France. How'd they get away with that? Well, it turns out that traditional sausage making is also done by inoculating the sausages with bacteria, and the bacteria eat the Neu5Gc. And traditionally, there was no storage system for food except by fermentation or smoking, and you always used all parts of the animal. So just so happens that bacteria did the job of taking the harm out of Neu5Gc containing products. And that explains why these long-lived people are actually not being harmed by these foods, but are actually getting a benefit out of these foods. Who knew?
Okay, so these people over in Europe are fermenting their sausages and cheese to remove the Neu5Gc.
They didn't know that's what they were doing.
No, but now we can look back and figure that out.
Now we can say, hey, how come these guys get away with this?
My question then is, come to North America, the way we process sausage and cheese, is it still doing the same thing there?
Nope. Yeah, so a Kraft single slice is not cheese by any means, and we've discovered ways bypassing this process. When I was growing up, literally up until Wonder Bread, all bread was fermented. That's how you raised a loaf, but it doesn't make for a uniform, beautiful whole. So bread makers figured out how to do the process without using any fermentation, using glutaminases to do the job and raise things without any process of bacterial fermentation. It's the same thing. Bread may look like bread, but it has nothing to do with the original feature. The other thing that we know is that bacteria really enjoy eating lectins. There are lectin-eating bacteria. They love eating all sorts of things. When we fermented our bread years ago, they were really good at eating the lectins and a lot of the sugars in these grains, but nobody does that anymore. So things look like what they used to look like. They certainly don't taste like what they used to look like, but they bear no relationship to what sustained us 100 years ago.
Okay, so to get practical, somebody's going to Whole Foods, buying organic pork sausages. Have any of those been fermented this way? Like, is there anything we can go to the store and buy meat-wise, or sausage-wise, that is done this way?
So if you actually get a sausage from Italy or France or Portugal, where, it's all white on the outside and gnarly, and it doesn't just have an Italian name. I see so many of my patients fooled by, I bought, so-and-so Italian name sausage. And I go, well, where was it made? They go, well, where do you look? Oh, San Francisco. I said, no, sorry. There are people, a good friend of mine, I'll drop his name, Jimmy Schmidt, who's won 3 James Beard Awards. Great chef and a good friend of mine. He ferments his hot dogs and bratwursts and removes Neu5Gc. Whoa.
Okay. So when it comes to Neu5Gc, foods that we don't have to worry about, chicken, fish, seafood, any other animal product, including dairy from goat and sheep, contains it.
Right. So we
need the fermentation in there to remove it before it's safe for us to eat.
Right. So for instance, a goat or sheep yogurt, Neu5Gc will be gone. A goat or sheep kefir, it'll be gone. Traditionally fermented cheeses, it'll be gone, which is the exciting thing. And so, here's a pretty lethal molecule that traditional cultures have deactivated through the process of preserving something that was not being able to be refrigerated, like milk and meats. And it just so happens that the bacteria and us, we're supposed to get along very well. And in a way, the book is about, look, bacteria and everybody else who lives in your gut really has your back if you'd stop starving them and killing them off. How we started this interview is we've done a spectacular job of stabbing them not only in the back, but smashing their face in as well.
So when it comes to red meat, steaks and things like that, they're a no-go even over in Europe. They're not processing those in a way. For somebody who's like, I'm not giving up my steak, is there any hope for them?
So, I have no dog in this fight. People say, you're a radical vegan. Well, I'm certainly not a vegan. I grew up in Omaha. I grew up in Milwaukee. Bratwurst, was, one of the finest foods invented by mankind. Anyhow, the problem is that we've lost sight of how harmful this stuff is, number one. Number two, all the grass-fed, grass-finished beef in the world is not going to get rid of Neu5Gc. It may be that wet or dry aging of these beef was the traditional way of eating the Neu5Gc. I haven't found anybody who's done a study on it, but I'm very suspicious that in the process of dry or wet aging, where you see all this fungus and bacterial cultures on these cuts of meat, that's was another way of reducing Neu5Gc. By the way, the highest content of Neu5Gc is in liver. And so I just love all these guys who said, you got to have all your organ meats. They're so good for you. Not.
Or even beef bone broth you talk about in the book.
Yeah, or even beef bone broth. Sorry. It's full of Neu5Gc.
But when you look back at history, wouldn't we have to assume a lot of red meat was eaten throughout our evolution?
Well, we actually... don't get me started. It's another book that's on the way. We actually were shellfish and fish eaters wading in streams and in the Indian Ocean. And that's actually where our big brains came from. And that's actually where the hair pattern on us came from. And long story short, and guess what? Your foot is not good for running. It's actually a flipper. Take a look sometime.
Can't wait for the new book. We're talking about the new book, but the next new book.
So that's a problem. And again, there is, sorry about it, folks, there's very, very, very strong associations between red meat eating and cancer, for instance. Now, that gets really interesting because it turns out that cancer cells, tumors, utilize Neu5Gc to produce localized inflammation that actually the white blood cells produce the environment of an oxygen-low environment that allows cancer cells to thrive and prevents normal cells from thriving. And why do they do that? Because Neu5G is inflammatory. And so that was a piece of the puzzle. We knew that Neu5Gc was in tumors. Every tumor you ever remove is full of Neu5Gc. And yet we do not manufacture Neu5Gc. We have no mechanism to do it. We don't have the gene. We don't have the enzyme. So Neu5Gc in cancer cells had to be acquired from the diet. And it's only present in beef, lamb, pork, and milk.
Earlier, when you mentioned the Neu5Gc in the animals that we're getting it from, not making it into the brain, do we have any idea why our anatomy and physiology is different and it can pass through?
Yeah, because Neu5Gc in us, when we eat it, is incorporated into this protective wall, the blood-brain barrier of the brain. And we then attack that blood-brain barrier because it now has a foreign substance. And Neu5Gc then gets through the blood-brain barrier. Sadly, as I write about in the book, if you have leaky gut, I will guarantee you have leaky brain. And if you don't want brain fog, if you don't want depression, if you don't want dementia or Parkinson's, then you don't want leaky gut because you don't want leaky brain.
As you talk about that mechanism, I hear where you're coming from there. The fact that as we're eating these animals, it becomes incorporated into the blood-brain barrier. Antibodies attack it, make that now porous for things to go through.
Porous.
Where my head goes now is thinking about leaky gut in general, the gut itself. So as we're eating Neu5Gc, is that being incorporated into the gut wall and then the antibodies perforating that as well?
That's why the idea that bone broth is healing to your gut is just one of the greatest internet myths that I encountered.
Were you at one point a believer in it?
No. You'll notice that Gundry MD never and never will sell a broth product, an animal-based collagen product. The science is so good that I wouldn't put my name on it. Remember, my name is on my products, and I'm not there to follow some crazy hype.
Coming back to the antibody piece, I'm picturing the cow who we're getting the Neu5Gc from. Do animals ever make antibodies, autoantibodies themselves?
No.
That keeps their gut intact then and their blood-brain barrier intact. Okay.
Yeah, they don't. Again, we realize that we're not making autoantibodies to Neu5Ac. That was the theory. Now we know that, we don't have to have that theory. We now know that Neu5Gc, which is foreign, we make antibodies to it, and that Neu5Gc is incorporated into these protective structures in our gut wall, in our blood vessels, in our joints, in our brain. And so our natural antibodies that we make to Neu5Gc then attack these things. And as I lay out in Gut Check, with a lot of references that there is this correlation between beef, lamb, pork, and milk eating and all of these diseases and cancer. Strong. And now we have the mechanism. I'm glad we have the mechanism because now we can put an end to this, that's just conjecture. Association does not mean causation. We now have the mechanism of causation.
All right, well, we can't leave this topic without getting into carnivore. And the two of us have discussed it before, but now that we have all this new information brought into the picture, how do you feel about this group of people online, obviously in person as well, but we see them online, who have been on this diet for a period of time, presumably healing from different conditions, including autoimmune, and you're somebody who's still in clinical practice 6 days a week. I'm sure you see a lot of these people coming to see you, and you've probably seen success stories. Given what we just said, how is that happening?
Well, I have success stories in my own practice. I'll put people on an elimination diet, and part of it, of course, is, for the most part, getting glyphosate out of their diet, getting lectin-containing foods out of their diet. And, the original, for instance, Atkins diet was basically an elimination diet. It got lectins out of people, and it was actually very effective. So, and we see this work. I have a patient who's also a dear personal friend who was a vegan. And one of my typical not very healthy vegans. And eventually, we got to the point of putting him on a carnivore diet, if you want to call it that, and he dramatically improved. Went from having like 5 or 6 loose bowel movements a day to normal form stools, and he's happy as a clam. Now, like all of my patients who do this, many of them have remarkable success. But when we look at their blood work, we see a progressive increase in, we have a measurement of stickiness of blood vessels that's called PLA2, that really looks at whether your blood vessels are lined with fly paper or not. I'm old enough to remember fly paper. And it goes up. And we look at other inflammatory markers, and it goes up. And we look at oxidized LDL, which, if you like the cholesterol theory of heart disease, which I'm not wild about, if you like the cholesterol theory of heart disease, then cholesterol has to be oxidized. And these people in general, their oxidized cholesterol goes up. So, yeah, you're almost certainly making their symptoms better. But I think this is a short-term fix. For instance, right now, with him, just based on his new blood work, we're going to start weaning him off some of these foods. In him, we try to use mostly wild fish and shellfish as part of his diet. He and his partner live over in Portugal now, so they have much better access to, for instance, he really only eats fermented sausages as part of his diet, just to give you an example.
I'm just picturing the carnivore here in North America, though, consuming steaks left, right, and center, ground beef, accumulating all this Neu5Gc that we're talking about into their body, building up the antibodies, attacking their gut, their blood-brain barrier. If that's happening, how can the two happen at the same time? The healing plus this cascade, like we're talking about, of incorporation and attacking the body.
Well, remember, you don't clog your blood vessels overnight. You don't destroy your joints overnight. You don't destroy your brain overnight. This is a long-term process. Luckily, we can measure these things happening. We can measure neuroinflammation. We can measure breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. We can certainly measure leaky gut, and we can measure it getting better or getting worse. So most of the blood tests that docs use in their regular practice never even look at this. I mean, I train third-year family practice residents in my clinic. They rotate through on a monthly basis. And these are doctors who are about to enter practice. This is their third year. And to a person, they have never heard of measuring a fasting insulin level. They've never heard of how to measure insulin resistance. And it's like, first time it happened. What do you mean? This is, I always say, if you have one blood test, you only get one blood test, that's it. That's all anybody's going to pay for, or it's a fasting insulin level. If I only had one to predict somebody's fate. And yet they're not even taught this in 2023, going on 2024. So that's how these things are missed. And what I've been spending my 25 years now doing this is trying to figure out how Hippocrates knew all this. And gut check is my way of saying, here's what the guy knew. And here's why he said all disease begins in the gut. And the good news is all disease can be cured in the gut. So that's the exciting part of all this.
We're going to get deep into the gut in a bit here, but I want to continue on this train of thought here. And I'm picturing somebody right now who, say, comes to see you or otherwise. They've been having non-fermented dairy, all kinds of red meat, pork. There are Neu5
GC nightmare.
It's a nightmare word. Neu5Gc nightmare bomb.
Yeah.
What hope do they have to clear that up? It's been incorporated in their system. They've got the autoantibodies. How does it clean itself up?
That's the great thing. And like I talk about in the book, the less you eat of Neu5Gc containing foods, beef, lamb, pork, milk, and the more you eat of wild fish, wild shellfish, properly raised chickens, the more these sugar molecules are displaced from where they're hanging out with Neu5Ac. And that's the exciting thing. You can actually say, okay, I want a grass-fed, grass-finished filet once a week or once a month. What do you say? And I say, hey, that'll be great. Let's not have it twice a day like the average American does. Let's have time to knock those guys out. Or go, when we're over in Italy, we have all these amazing salamis and charcuterie for breakfast, late breakfast, every day. And we're just amazed that when I go around studying these long people, they have these sausages, and it's go, wait a minute, you don't have any coronary disease, you're not dying of cancer, and you're eating this really bad stuff for you. And then you start going, well, maybe this bad stuff isn't bad, and why isn't it bad? So that's why these people, like one of my books, there's a farmer in Campagnella who used to be one of the longest living people in Italy. They all left as the tourists. But he said, for a year, I feed my pig, and then for a year, the pig feeds me and my family. And it's actually a pretty cool description. So they didn't eat the pig. They didn't freeze the pig. They ground up the pig and made it into sausage.
So given what you know about this Neu5Gc, are you periodically still having things like steak and lamb and pork?
Yeah. So
given that we can remove it from the body by having the quote unquote good foods.
Yeah, I'll do it maybe once a month. I don't have lamb anymore. Lamb, unfortunately, is the highest form of highest containing Neu5Gc. But we have a local farmer with grass-fed, grass-finished beef that supplies a restaurant around here, and we'll have it every now and then. But it's now a treat. If you think ice cream is a dangerous treat, then we should view that grass-fed, grass-finished beef as a dangerous treat.
So again, coming back to the animal products that we can have, chicken, which we've gone deep into the details earlier on. Given what you're sharing today, a lot of people are going to start swaying more towards chicken and fish and seafood. Let's talk about the fish and seafood piece. Like we did the chicken, what we need to know to get the best quality, since we're potentially going to be eating more of that now.
Here's the bad news. We know that, as I talk about in Gut Check, that microplastics are everywhere, that microplastics are particularly present in our ocean, and that microplastics are incorporated into fish flesh, and that the more microplastics you eat, the more you get gut dysbiosis, abnormal growth of bacteria in your gut. More bad guys, less good guys, all from microplastics. Now, there's been a study in humans looking at microplastics in their feces, and the 8 people in that human study who had the most microplastics in their feces, 7 of the 8 of them were fish eaters. Shellfish don't seem to accumulate microplastics very much. Shellfish, like mussels, may be one of your healthiest foods that you can consume. These are filter feeders, but in fact, they're really efficient at cleaning the ocean, but they don't appear to accumulate microplastics like fish flesh does. Obviously, wild fish is better. Salmon in general are primarily algae eaters and don't seem to have a whole lot of microplastics. Sadly, so many of our fish now are farm raised and fed God knows what, but probably stay away from farm raised fish. There's a very popular fish, Italian, called branzino, which you'll see on menus. All branzino are farm raised now; they're not wild caught anymore. So just be careful. So I tend to eat wild shrimp, wild oysters, clams, mussels, calamari, perfectly safe. Squid.
Okay. So that plus the good quality chicken.
Now, let me tell you,
of course, this is going to take some digging to find the better sources, but that's part of the journey here.
Yeah, I mean, around every turn, there's bad news. Almost all the squid that we eat comes from Chinese factory ships that have invaded coastal territories of sovereign nations, particularly in South America, and have decimated the local fish population because of netting these squid. And yet almost every squid, except in certain areas in California, is from factory Chinese ships. And maybe you don't want them in the coastal waters off of Peru or Chile. I don't particularly want them there, but I'm not going to get in a boat with Greenpeace and run around and try to stop them. Maybe I should.
Given what you've shared about how toxic, a lot of the practices are when it comes to meat, and I'm talking now about the chicken and seafood and fish, do you recommend somebody coming into this who has eaten a more classic type diet to do a detox of some sort to clean a lot of this stuff out? Like if I'm a new patient of yours and I'm eating a regular type diet and living a regular lifestyle, as you talk about things like glyphosate and microplastics, and there's so many things in our air, water, food that are toxifying us, is it important to start out when somebody comes into this information like we're talking about today to start off with a detox to clean a lot of that out? And then for somebody like you who's aware and making these changes, do you still periodically do something like that to keep your insides clean?
Well, one of the interesting things that I talk about in Gut Check is when you look at these super old people, these super agers, and you look at their gut microbiome, you see some remarkable, similar microbiome, no matter where these people live in the world, and actually no matter what diet they eat. But one of the unique features about these superagers is their microbiome is really good at detoxifying xenobiotics. Now, xenobiotics is this kind of catch-all phrase for all these various. Antibiotic means obviously anti-living. Xenobiotics are things like these endocrine disruptors, the plastics, the glyphosate. And these superagers have bacteria that will eat these various things. Now, I mentioned in the book, there are now bacteria that can eat oil spills. Bacteria are just looking for carbon atoms. And all of these materials are basically carbon. They're petroleum-based. And so it's not far-fetched to imagine that if there's a source of carbon, a bacteria will find a way to eat that carbon and utilize it. And that's actually, I think, some of the exciting things that came from the Human Microbiome Project, that bacteria will find niches that, they'll utilize a carbon source. And what's cool about these superagers is that they have these bacteria that eat these things before they can become a problem to us. And that's the other part of gut check is certainly everyone has leaky gut that I encounter. And Hippocrates was right. All disease comes from a leaky gut. Paper I gave in France at a GI meeting a couple of years ago. But so leaky gut is one piece, but what the other piece was what we started with was we used to have a robust microbiome whose job was to sustain their home, us. And they had all these tools. It's like, the offensive front floor of a great football team. And, you keep everybody away from the quarterback. Now, because of what we've done, we've killed them with antibiotics, with glyphosate, and we starve them to death, which is the other part. Our diet used to be loaded with fibers that we couldn't digest that would arrive and be greeted by all these hungry microbes and go, yeah, love it. And we know now that it was great to feed them, but what we didn't know was that by feeding these guys, they would in turn produce the agents that ensured our health, that ensured our mental happiness, our clarity. And these are now postbiotics. So I used to call them bacterial poop, and it's not a bad way of thinking about it. But the book is also devoted to, okay, how do we feed our microbiome? What do they need besides these foods to actually make these postbiotics that we absolutely need for healing the wall of our gut, fighting cancer, keeping our brain intact? And one of the, I think, revelations of the book, and certainly seeing my patients literally 6 days a week, I'll see some after we're done today, is it was far more complex than any of us even thought before the Human Microbiome Project. And we didn't know that, for instance, we didn't know that I could feed you so much fiber till, you're a termite. And we didn't know that your gut bacteria, without assistance from other compounds, couldn't take that fiber and turn it into the things we'd like butyrate, for instance. We didn't know that there was an assembly line of gut bacteria, and that one bacteria over here who had maybe nothing to do with making butyrate, all of a sudden he makes a compound that gut bacteria number 2 needs to make another compound that gut bacteria number 3 needs, that then makes the compound that the butyrate producing bacteria can take fiber and make butyrate. And without one of those guys on the assembly line, the whole thing falls apart. And that's where the whole concept of gut diversity comes from. The other thing that I think is interesting is we used to classify bacteria as good or bad. And there were the bad guys, and you didn't want the bad guys, and you wanted good guys. Well, that's not true at all. It turns out a lot of the bad guys are really important, but they have to have their spot in the whole system. And we talk about a party that we're throwing, and there may be some people who aren't exactly welcome at the party, but they certainly make it interesting. And that's all part of this complexity, this complex ecosystem, this symbiotic relationship between these denizens of our gut and us, that the complexity, just the reason I keep seeing patients 6 days a week is you just marvel at how well designed this was and how really good we've been at taking it all apart.
All right, which naturally brings us to somebody who's middle-aged, say, tuning in, understanding now the importance of this microbiome and the intricacy and the fact that antibiotics and glyphosate, we've been killing it, and there's so many different layers to this and complexities. But for somebody that has starved it by not providing fiber or things like glyphosate and antibiotics killed it, we're starting out with, really poor template to work with. What hope do we have if the bacteria we want aren't there to begin with to start to rev things up?
Well, the exciting thing is you can, number one, reintroduce these guys. And number 2, you can get them the foods they want. It's not as simple as people would think. Back when I started this, I thought you could heal leaky gut in a couple of weeks. I was really naive. It usually takes 9 months to a year. The longest it's taken me is about 1.5 years. One of the things that shocks patients when we look at whether they have leaky gut or not, and what antibodies they have, 100% of people with an autoimmune disease or leaky gut have antibodies to wheat gluten, wheat germ agglutinin, non-wheat proteins. 100%. They all have them. Even people who have been gluten-free for 10 years. And they're shocked. Well, wait a minute, I don't eat gluten. I haven't eaten gluten, I've been gluten-free for 10 years. And they have all these antibodies to gluten. And I said, I didn't say you're eating gluten. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, look, way back when, 70, 80% of all of our white blood cells, all of our immune system, lines the wall of our gut. Why? Because, quite frankly, that's where mischief can come across the border. And our troops are there. Now, back in the good old days, the microbiome actually educated the immune system about what it should be worried about and what the microbiome had to protect it. And the microbiome simplistically says, look, you guys go have a donut and a cigarette. We've got everybody. We'll handle all the bad guys. We'll handle anything that comes down the pike. Relax. And the wall of the gut was intact, and so the immune system says, yeah, okay, you're right. Nothing going on here. Now, unfortunately, our offensive front four is gone. We're getting guys out of the stands to play football. And now we've got leaks in the wall of our gut, and we have all these particles coming across, whether they're food particles, whether they're bacteria, whether they're lectins. And now our immune system is got a Kevlar vest on. They've got 2 AK-47s and their fingers on the trigger. And so even someone who hasn't eaten gluten, but who has leaky gut, now the immune system is armed and dangerous and going, okay, I used to hate gluten and the wall is down. If I see gluten, I'll be ready. My antibody shield is up. And what's really exciting, and the reason I keep doing this, is with every passing month, we watch the immune system lose all of this trigger happy fingers. The immune system goes from bright red, all these antibodies to gluten, for instance, to green. No antibodies to gluten, no antibodies to wheat germ gluten, no antibodies. 70% of people with leaky gut have antibodies to corn, the various components of corn. And the exciting thing is you can retrain the immune system. How? Repair the wall of the gut and getting bacteria that then tell the immune system, hey, go have a donut, cigarette, we got your back again. And you can measure this. And people can feel it, obviously, but you can measure it. And they can say, you mean this isn't in my mind. Yeah, look, here it is.
So for somebody right now who is suffering with, say, a leaky gut, their microbiome has been destroyed, what is the first step? Or do you like to attack both of those at the same time? Do you like to patch up the holes and then build the microbiome up, or vice versa, or together? How does that work?
Well, so we can seal somebody's leaky gut, and there's good compounds to do that. I make several products that do that. The problem is, as I tell my patients, I can seal your leaky gut, but if you keep swallowing razor blades every day, then you'll just slice it right back open. And I think that's one of the things that either made me believable or not believable is that we know that lectins are one of the best plant defense systems ever invented. And we've shown that getting these out of people's diets or using traditional fermentation techniques that our ancient ancestors had figured out detoxify these plant compounds and make them harmless. And so it's a 1-2 punch. First of all, you got to get the troublemakers out of your diet, number one. Number two, it isn't enough just to eat fiber. The husband and wife team at Stanford, the Sonnenbergs, did I think, a really important experiment in humans 2 years ago now. They took two groups of people. One of them they gave a high fiber diet to, primarily a soluble fiber called inulin. And the other group was given the higher fiber diet, but they were also given fermented foods. In this case, sauerkraut, kimchi, in this case, a lot of yogurt and kefir. And what they found was that the group that just got the high fiber had no change in their gut diversity, and they had no change in their inflammatory markers. But the group that got both the fiber and the fermented foods had an increase in microbial diversity, and their inflammatory markers went down. And so it kind of confirms that you've got to have the precursors for the bacteria to use fiber to make what you're looking for, like, for instance, butyrate. And without those precursors, those postbiotics, it's not going to work. And there's a chapter, dead men tell no tales, but dead bacteria do. And most probiotic-containing foods have no living bacteria in them. Most yogurts, they're all dead. Kimchi, they're all dead. That's a bunch of hooey. And even if they made it into the stomach acid would destroy them. Well, so what's going on? We can prove the benefit. Well, it turns out that these dead bacteria have made postbiotics in these materials, and the dead bacteria themselves, the wall of that bacteria, contains important information that is read by bacteria in the gut. And that, I was walking my 3 male dogs this morning. And part of the ritual, of course, is we have to sniff every bush, every tree, and of course, leave a mark. And my wife accuses me of leaving marks too, but that's another story. What are they doing? I can't smell the information, but clearly other dogs have left information. That's important information. Fido down the block was here, and Fido changed his dog food yesterday or something. But it's very important information. We're now realizing that bacteria read this information. And part of the fun of gut check is we know that bacteria can count the number of friends in the neighborhood, and bacteria can get together in a rave. It's called quorum sensing. And unless bacteria have a certain number of their friends nearby that they can actively count, they won't make a move to produce a compound that we might need. And so, I spend the first chapter talking about how a single cell organism like toxoplasmosis can completely rewire the brain of a higher animal like us to do its bidding, to find a cat. That's another story.
There's a lot here I want to get into, including I'd like to hear the rest of that story. But you mentioned the Sonnenbergs and the fact with their research, fiber alone didn't have the impact. It had to be fiber with the fermented foods. You also said, which is really profound, I want to highlight this piece, the fact that fermented foods aren't providing the bacteria like we've always pictured going into the gut and repopulating. It's the information from the fermented food that is reigniting something in there, which to me brings up, how does that work? Because as we talked about glyphosate antibiotics, if we've wiped everything out, and you do touch on this in the book, I want you to expand on it, there must still be something there, even if we've decimated our gut microbiome in the past, that fermented foods are picking up on and causing that repopulation. So talk about that.
Yes. And we've known now for a number of years that, so the surface area of the gut is the same as a tennis court. In fact, I just read a new paper that it might be 2 tennis courts worth of surface area, big surface area. Well, that surface area is made possible by this shag carpet, primarily in our small intestines, and they're called villi and microvilli, and literally is a shag carpet. And they're in the energy paradox. There are roots that are embedded in our soil, and the soil is the microbiome and the food we eat. So at the base of these microvilli are crypts, and the crypts are quite unique. The crypts have a pocket of stem cells that can repopulate the walls of the microvilli very rapidly, and they have a deposit of important keystone bacterial species that are kept at the bottom of the crypt. And there's an actual really cool relationship between the stem cells and the immune system and this pocket of bacteria. We also know that the appendix is not a vestigial organ, that the appendix is a really nice storage system for these really important bacteria. And there's good studies that show that if you wipe out bacterial flora, the crypts and the appendix will repopulate. They're hiding. And so you've got to entice them to come out. And part of what I think is happening, and like the Sonnenbergs have shown, is that these messages from dead bacteria the bacteria cell walls themselves and these postbiotics, along with vitamin D, is enough to coax these guys out of hiding. And that's what's, I guess, the most exciting thing. It ain't over until it's over. And the redundancy that's available is what's exciting. I mean, I talk about there's a keystone species called akkermansia mucinophila, mucus-loving akkermansia. And it's an incredibly important bug in our gut. It lives in the mucus layer of our gut. It eats mucus. The more mucus it eats, the more the gut wall produces mucus, which is actually a good thing. But there are, quite frankly, competing companies. One company makes dead akkermansia, and the other company makes live akkermansia. And you can show experimentally that you'll get much the same effect from the dead bacteria as the live bacteria. In fact, there's slightly different effects. Some are better at certain things. But how in the world can a dead akkermansia do that? Well, it's because it's carrying information that is being read, like, oh, there's akkermansia in the neighborhood. That's a good thing. We like these guys. They don't know that they're dead. They're just reading that information in the cell wall. It's pretty amazing.
And when you talk about the two different kinds of akkermansia, are these probiotic supplement capsules?
Yeah.
Further elaborate on that, the importance of those, given the depth we're getting into now of gut health. Is this something, probiotics in general now, that have a lot of value, or how do you feel about those versus fermented foods?
Well, so we're beginning to understand who the important guys are in the microbiome and who aren't very important. We're beginning to understand that most of the probiotics we take are not part of our native flora. And yes, they will colonize for a couple of weeks. I say they basically come on vacation and, they have a good time, eat some of our food, and then leave. And maybe you have to keep giving them back. I've had the chief science officer and CEO of Pendulum Life, who makes the living akkermansia, on my podcast several times. I'm a big fan. But they don't even know. Do we have to keep taking this the rest of our lives? It is the human strain of akkermansia, but I don't know whether we have to keep taking it. Do I? Yeah, but again, I take a lot of stuff. We'll see. But we don't know. Obviously, these people who live forever in these countries aren't sitting around swallowing probiotic capsules, and they have just this incredible microbiome, but they don't have antibiotics in their food. They don't have glyphosate in their food. And they eat lots of fermented foods, which contain these probiotics. Last year at the microbiome meeting in Paris, some fascinating papers that there's a bacteria in raw milk cheeses in Italy that promotes leanness in people who eat it. And if you pasteurize the milk before you make it into the cheese, that bacteria is killed. So it had to be from raw milk that contained this bacteria. Now, are we trying to culture that bacteria? I'm not, but yes, there are people that are trying to do that. We know there's a bacteria in Japan that loves a component of seaweed that produces a chemical that makes Japanese who have this bacteria thin. Now, the problem is it has to have seaweed, and we have to see if we can grow that and figure out which seaweed to feed it and then put it in a capsule. So it gets more and more interesting every year about all these little micromanagement pieces, but that's what an ecosystem does.
Coming back to that cheese piece, you talked about the pasteurization versus unpasteurized. Was the bacteria just taking hold in that case with unpasteurized?
Correct.
Okay, because why I want to go back to that is because we know now from fermented foods, when we talk fermented foods, I'm picturing things like kimchi and sauerkraut,
Right.
that they're actually not living and repopulating in the gut. But in this cheese's case, it needed to be.
Correct.
So it just depends on the bacteria then?
Yep.
Okay.
And like I say, it gets more and more and more complex and interesting, particularly when again, without the Human Microbiome Project, we would have never known any of these existed because we didn't know, number one, that they were all these species. Number two, we had no idea what they did and how they did it. And we didn't know that one bacteria would need the product of another bacteria to make the product that we needed. It's like I talk about the wolves in Yellowstone Park, which is a great ecosystem. And people will remember that wolves, are the bad guys of Yellowstone, and they eat elk, and they were exterminated in Yellowstone. And of course, when that happened, there was no apex predator to eat the elk, and the elk overpopulated, and the elk ate all the saplings in the winter. Without saplings, beavers had nothing to build beaver dams with. So the beavers disappeared. Without the beaver dams, there wasn't a fish population, and so on and so forth. And the whole ecosystem actually fell apart. With removing a single bad guy, a wolf, when wolves were reintroduced, then the ecosystem, now over the last 15 years, is reestablished. And you go, wow, that really nasty wolf was really important. And it's like with the gut microbiome, there may be what we think is a really nasty bacteria. And if that bacteria gets into our bloodstream, it does really bad things. And maybe we should eradicate that bad bacteria. No, that bad bacteria is there for a reason. And we just didn't know what it was doing. We thought it was bad, but it had to do this sort of thing.
Earlier, when we were talking about leaky gut, we were talking about lectins being one of the culprits. For somebody that wants to really take this on and build up the microbiome, repair the gut, what are some of the other big culprits? We did talk about the different animal products earlier and how they get incorporated, and then the autoantibodies destroy the gut and the blood-brain barrier. But what are other things that people are doing on a regular basis that are causing leaky gut?
They're taking NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like Advil, Aleve, ibuprofen. Just saw a guy yesterday in the office who his wife drug him in, kicking and screaming. He's 66 years old, has Parkinson's, and pretty bad tremor on his left side. And he has a bad knee, and his doc has been giving him a prescription for meloxicam, which is potent, NSAID. And she brought it in, put it on the desk. And I said, well, certainly if I had Parkinson's, I certainly would not take that drug. And he said, well, why? I've got a bad knee. And I said, well, every time you swallow that pill, you swallowed a hand grenade. And it will, I guarantee you, blow holes in the wall of your gut. And through those holes, bacteria and food particles will get into your brain. They will travel up your vagus nerve directly to your motion center. And I've published lots of papers about this. And so if you want to make sure your Parkinson's get worse, then for sure keep taking that prescription pain medicine. Wife slugs him in the shoulder. He said, "I told you." And we do this willy-nilly. There's children's Advil, for goodness sakes. So that's just one. The other thing that he's on is an antacid drug, an acid-reducing medication, because he has heartburn. Well, no one bothered to tell him his heartburn is from the lectins he was eating. But those acid-reducing drugs, we have to have acid in our stomach to produce a normal bacterial flora, not only in our small intestine, but also in our colon. And without that acid in our stomach, there's a very strong correlation with dementia and Parkinson's with these drugs. And there's a black box warning on these drugs that you shouldn't take them for over 2 weeks' time. They're that dangerous. And yet GI docs and well-meaning family practice docs will have people on these drugs for 10, 15, 20 years and wondering why they have Parkinson's.
I want to come back to something we talked about early on that I want to make sure we hit on, antibiotics. And obviously we want to be careful how we use these, when we use these. But for somebody that is tuned into what we're talking about today, and they're in a situation where they need to use them, what is the best way leading up to, during, and after to keep our gut health, in check best we can if we're going to take them?
So remember, the vast majority of prescriptions for antibiotics are given for viral infections. And those viral infections are not treated by antibiotics. Why are they given? Because you go to your local doctor complaining of a sore throat or a congestion or sinus or cough. And if that doctor doesn't give you a prescription, you'll find another one who will. I actually learned this in medical school. I went to the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta back in the dark ages. And part of our rotations is we would go out in the community and follow a practitioner around for a week or so. And I was in a pediatrician's office. And this was back in the 70s. And so a kid would come in with a sore throat, and they'd take a swab looking for strep throat. And the nurse would hand the mother, as she went out the door, a prescription for antibiotics and a prescription for a decongestant. And so I'm watching them. Okay, I get it. You're swabbing the throat. You're going to see if it's strep throat or not, if it's beta hemolytic strep. Good for you. But you didn't wait. That's going to take 2 days to find out if this is strep throat, and it probably isn't. It's going to take 2 days to find that out. Why, doctor, did you have your nurse give her the prescription? And he says, "You don't understand medicine. I'm treating the mother. Kid is going to get better no matter what I do. If I don't give that mother something to do, then she'll go to my competitor down the street and he'll give it to her." And so it's self-preservation. And that is actually always stuck in my head. Most of the things we do in medicine is out of litigation, fear, out of, if I don't give it this, and oh my gosh, what if it is a really bad pneumonia? Why didn't I give her that? And there's a lawyer knocking on my door. That doesn't happen in England, where I trained, because malpractice suits are virtually non-existent, because the litigant actually has to pay for the attorney, not the other way around. So malpractice is very rare in England. But that's what drives our healthcare. So there's so many ways to, first of all, most of the stuff that happens in our mouth and lungs is viral. And so much, then antibiotics have no effect on these viruses. So just think twice before just taking a broad spectrum antibiotic. If you're really worried about it, ask your physician to do a culture of what you cough up and wait 48 hours and find out, okay, here's the bug, here's a specific antibiotic rather than this broad spectrum. We've overused these things so much that, for instance, in urinary tract infections, one of the most popular drugs for a very long time was Cipro. 50% of the bacteria that cause urinary tract infections are now resistant to Cipro, and yet it's given out like candy. I've had a couple people rupture their Achilles tendon from a complication of a widely used antibiotic. That's never fun.
But for somebody that does have to take it, is it beneficial to say take a probiotic before, during, and after?
Absolutely.
Up your fermented foods, certain things we can do to nullify that negative impact.
Yeah, it can take up to 2 years to repopulate your gut after a round of antibiotics. Holy mackerel.
Let's come back to our cat and mouse story. So come back to that and share what happens there.
All right, so there's most women who are pregnant are told to avoid cats and to have the husband scoop the kitty litter poop, scoop the poop. Why? Because women are warned that there is a potential protozoan, single-cell organism called toxoplasmosis, which is in cat poop. And the toxoplasmosis, if you're pregnant, can actually cause a very devastating infection in your fetus. Okay, so toxoplasmosis, like many, many parasites, has 2 phases of its life cycle, and it needs an intermediate host to get to its final host, the place it wants to be. Toxoplasmosis wants to be in a cat. But toxoplasmosis, to get to the cat, has to go through an intermediate life cycle. And the intermediate life cycle that is chosen is a rat or a mouse. Now, if you think about it, it's kind of a dumb choice for toxoplasmosis because rats and mice are afraid of cats and will run from the smell of cat urine and will run from the sight of a cat. But mice and rats can acquire toxoplasmosis from contaminated water that a cat has pooped in. Toxoplasmosis goes to the brain of this animal and works on the dopaminergic centers in the brain. And it first makes the smell of cat urine sexually attractive to the rat. And the smell just, the rat is now horny as hell to find the cat. It then hits the pleasure center that dopamine hits and blocks the anxiety, the fear filters, so that the rat actually runs to danger, runs towards the cat. And good news, the cat eats the rat. The toxoplasmosis gets in the cat where its final resting place is, and everybody's good. Okay, that's pretty impressive. But we know now that anywhere a cat exists, even a large cat like a mountain lion or a tiger, it wants to get into something that cat predates on. So in Yellowstone, we now know that wolves who are infected with toxoplasmosis become, in general, pack leaders. And why? Because they are far bolder and more likely to take risks than animals that aren't. Why would toxoplasmosis infect wolves? Because the other apex predator that eats wolves are mountain lions. And wolves will run towards mountain lions. It gets even better in the jungle. We know that chimpanzees are one of the favorite foods of tigers, And lo and behold, chimpanzees who are infected with toxoplasmosis are not afraid of tigers and tiger urine. It gets even better. Humans are some of the favorite foods of tigers in India and in Africa. And humans can be infected with toxoplasmosis to make them more interested, but it gets better than that. Most of the motorcyclists killed in accidents are infected with toxoplasmosis. They become fearless. And I mentioned that there is an interesting study that heroes who do heroic things are often infected with toxoplasmosis. And I'm not saying that that's why they are heroes, but it's an interesting correlation. So the point of all this is that single-cell organisms have remarkable power to influence just about everything that happens to us, including the way we think, the way we process information, our anxiety, our depression, our happiness. I'll give you an example. I have a product that is actually really good for improving your skin and hair. It's called BioSkin, and it has a bacteria that has been shown to really grow hair if you swallow it. But what's really cool is that bacteria also produces oxytocin, the love hormone. And it turns out that people who have a lot of this bacteria in their gut are actually far more loving and outgoing and friendly than people who don't have this bacteria in their gut. Cool.
As you talk about hair there, it gets me thinking about the skin microbiome, oral microbiome. You talk about in your book, tumors even have a microbiome. So this is well beyond the gut, which is the typical way it's looked at.
Right. It's a few years ago, it was discovered that one of the ways to diagnose pancreatic cancer is that it has a particular microbiome, and that you can do swabs in the oral cavity and have a prediction of pancreatic cancer based on that oral cavity microbiome. We know that plaque in human coronary arteries contain oral microbiome bacterial remnants, DNA. And we know that people who have gingivitis, particularly in their upper mouth, have far more dementia and Parkinson's because, quite frankly, this is a direct shot into the brain. It's about an inch away from your teeth. And so there's all these connections that we should have been aware of. We know that we have to have the right oral microbiome to make nitric oxide out of nitrates that we eat, and that mouthwash destroys those bacteria. And studies have shown if you give people mouthwash, their systolic blood pressure goes up by about 7 points. And if you take away their mouthwash for a month or so, their systolic blood pressure comes back down. Like I write in the book, you want minty fresh breath and hypertension. It's like, whoa.
Well, given the importance of the oral microbiome, as you're emphasizing here, other than mouthwash, what are some of the top things that we're doing to destroy that microbiome? And then what are the things we can do to build that back up?
Well, there is certainly some sense that fluoride in toothpaste is a pretty good way to destroy the oral microbiome. I don't use fluoride in my toothpaste. It's unfortunately, a lot of drinking water, but I have a water filter to get fluoride out. That's certainly a place to start. There are toothpastes now that are better at producing oral microbiome. There are even tablets that you can purchase with important oral microbiome that you just chew. So there's ways around this.
All right, Dr. Gundry, really appreciate you coming back on the show, sharing all this. And the new book is Gut Check. We're going to link that up in the show notes. Really enjoyed it. We're going to link up your website, your social media, everything in the show notes. Always a pleasure to chat, and thank you again.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been great talking. It's scary out there, but it's fixable. And the book is trying to scare people, but give them a fix. So that's my purpose.
Now that you're done with Dr. Gundry, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Dr. Davis. He's got a lot more to share about the microbiome. You don't want to miss this. I'll see you over there.
It would be hard, Jesse, to find diseases, modern diseases, that are not either initiated or exacerbated by the microbiome. Look what we're doing with reduction.